Hi guys, great to have you with me again. Alan Robson, of course, and a big thank you to everybody who's bought themselves a copy of Grisly Tales from Northumbria. Over 160 stories, tales, myths, legends, and the real stories of people who've witnessed things in those places. So in the new year, once we break free, we'll be out ghost hunting in all of those areas. At least I hope you will. That's what the Grisly Tales are all about. But the Grisly Tales podcast is out. And I'm gone looking in a place that will make you feel very uncomfortable if you own a dog. Even more uncomfortable if you have small children. Because dogs are killing children up and down the country with a surprising number right here in the glorious north. So if you can listen through that, and if you're a regular to our Grisly Tales podcast, you'll probably manage it. It will be uncomfortable if you have certain breeds of dogs, mate. I do warn you that. Then we get into a conspiracy theory. Back in 1996, a plane crashed. Well, it didn't actually crash. It exploded in the sky and nobody knew why. There's been a mystery and several cover-ups about this plane. I'm taking a closer look and letting you decide who you think is responsible for it. And I think you'll be able to work it out damn quick. We stop there. We vanish off into the Scottish Highlands with a tale of murder and a ghost, a vengeful ghost that comes back and, many believe, kills the person responsible. That's a great tale, don't miss it. And to end with, I take you to the Sunshine Islands of Barbados with another story that's bittersweet, inspiring, and the birth of Barbados has a ghost story attached that you may never have heard before. The Alan Robson Grisly Tales podcast. You can get it from all the places you usually get your podcasts from. And also, don't forget, if you've got time and you fancy going on an adventure to some terrifying place somewhere on earth with me, robsonsworld.com hopefully will look after you. Thanks for your time. Thanks for listening to this. And I hope you enjoy all of the things that we've got in store for you. Hi everybody, and welcome to another of Alan Robson's Grisly Tales. I'm going to start with something particularly grisly about you and your family. Now, if you've ever been tempted by these ancestry sites that you can write in for, let me just take you back even further than they do. Allow me to be a free anthropologist just for you. Do you know that way back in prehistoric times, your ancestors were cannibals? Now, occasionally, starving people have resorted to being a cannibal just to save their own lives. Throughout history, there's a lot of stories of cannibalism where people would feed on people that had been killed during a siege and they couldn't get food from anywhere. The sinking of the HMS Essex in 1820. The crew there would not have survived if they hadn't eaten the dead bodies of their comrades. So many stories we've quite often told you about cannibal killers. But let's go back to the history of cannibalism. They have, in Moulagursi Cave in France, 100,000-year-old bones of 6 Neanderthal cavemen who they can prove were killed for food. They've been damaged in such a way to extract bone marrow and to get the brains out of their heads. The bones have the marks of carving, the same way you would carve a joint of meat. The Cheddar Man is very famous. His skeleton's from round about 7,000 years BC.
and a lot of people believe that he was a victim of cannibalism. Once again, his bones look like some butcher has cut away to get the flesh off the bones. Now, if that was the case, that cannibalism was relatively common back then, did it stop and then all of a sudden start up again later on? Well, not really. Throughout history, people have ended up eating one another. Now, geneticists tell us that Neanderthals became extinct following a disease that can only spread through eating human flesh, and the entire species ultimately became wiped out. The disease is called Kuru, and the Neanderthals were wiped out because they were eating their fellow human beings. During the Crusades in the Middle Ages, during the siege of Mara, when the Crusaders burst into the town, they hacked everybody to death. After all, they were spreading the word of God, so they made sure they killed everybody, the men, the women, and the children, and then they fed on them. Now, you can also go back to the time of mummies. Back in Egypt, they did, from time to time, eat one another. During the Great Famine in the 1300s, when there literally was nothing to eat, people would kill their older relatives and feast on their dead bodies. In some cases, when members of their families died of starvation, they fed on them too, eating their own mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters. And in a case of a family with 11 children, 9 of them were eaten. Only 2 survived. What would you do if you couldn't get any food? And the way things are going, who knows, that time might just be around the corner. Now, people in Texas will tell you that if you go back to the earliest days of the Native Americans, they had 2 tribes there that were cannibals. We've told you in many of our stories on Robson's World, where we go around Caribbean islands, that the Caribs, where the name Caribbean comes from, they practiced ritualized cannibalism. The Wari people practiced cannibalism, especially the cannibalism of already dead bodies. You would have your funeral, you would pay tribute to your friend or your relative, and then the body would come out, be put into a cooking pit, and carved like you would carve a joint. There were numerous stories of cannibalism across all of Asia. You go to South America, it's said that the Aztecs ate some people. Now, there's no evidence that it was a big part of their diet, but you can prove that on occasions, especially if they'd captured a very brave warrior, that they would kill that warrior and eat him, believing that some of the power that he had would be passed to those that ate him. Now, if you happen to be a cosmopolitan traveller, you may well have visited Papua in New Guinea, because since the early 1400s, the Korowai people have been cannibals. Today, they still are cannibals in Papua New Guinea. In 1503, in Iran, militants ate all of the dead bodies of their enemies. And as the enemy army looked up and watched them, they took the bodies raw up to the battlements and fed on them to try and scare away their attackers. The Spanish conquistadors, they committed cannibalism when their ship crashed on an island that had no food, just water. So they began with the cabin boy and started working their way up. And fortunately for the officers, they still had 2 members of the crew left when a boat came to collect them. Now, in the 1500s, a Hungarian man called György Dósa was condemned to sit on a heated iron throne. His skin began to stick to it and cook. So then they put on a heated iron crown and gave him a scepter, mocking the fact that he really wanted to be king of that country. 9 fellow rebels had been starved beforehand, and they were taken into the room where Dosha was sitting on that fire, literally cooking. So they gave his 9 friends tools, pliers, and they forced them into Dosha's skin, tearing off huge pieces of his cooked flesh. They were orders for them to eat the flesh, and they did. 3 refused, and they were hacked to death and thrown onto the fire. All of the others complied. Dosha, of course, was eaten to death, and the rebels who had eaten him were actually released. Now, French settlers in America, some of the very earliest, were trapped by Native American tribes and ended up eating one another. Only 1/10 of their number survived to flee and come back to Europe. A very famous man called Peter Stump, I may well tell you his full story at a later date. He was known as the Werewolf of Bedburg, and he was executed in 1589 after eating people, and a whole host of other crimes that he committed. Now, you may have watched a television program called Jamestown. Well, in the 1600s, Jamestown in Virginia, in America, they ended up eating one another in a year that they called the starving time. All of the food had gone, so colonists began to dig up the recently dead bodies of their friends for food. And during this same time, one man was tortured until he confessed having killed, salted, and eaten his pregnant wife and their unborn child. He was burned alive as punishment, and some say 2 days later his burnt body was dug up and eaten. Polish soldiers in the 1600s tried to attack Moscow's Kremlin, and after a long siege, they ended up eating one another too. Some Cossacks cannibalized corpses of Siberian Aborigines that they had massacred. And don't think it's just other faiths that do it. In 1672, a Christian mob hanged Johann de Witt and then ate his body after cooking it on a fire. Now, we're at the 1600s. Surely it doesn't go beyond the 1600s, this cannibalism business. Oh, yes, it does. A boat called the Luxborough Galley sank in 1727. The survivors spent 2 weeks on a rocky crag with very little water and no food, and they fought each other to the death, and those that lost were eaten. A French soldier and a showman who was on the stage, he was known as Tarare, and he admitted that while he was fighting abroad, he engaged in cannibalism. Also in the 1700s, Charles Dormery admitted that he had eaten pieces of a fellow crew member's severed leg. It had got gangrene. They'd cut it off, and rather than waste it, as there was very little food, they cooked and ate the gangrenous limb. Now, in a magazine published in the middle 1700s, there was an account by 2 sailors, a guy called Thomas Thompson and Simon McCrone, who was Irish. They were crew survivors from a ship carrying slaves. The ship was called Mary, and it was lost at sea, travelling from Lisbon to Guinea. Now, the 2 seamen said when they first set sail in 1736, they were rescued by a schooner who picked them up and landed them in Bridgetown, Barbados, where they had to give a sworn deposition. Now, the men described in graphic detail how the ship had sprung a leak, the slaves were unchained to help pump the ship, to get the water out of the ship, and then the ship finally sank. And they also told how 8 men abandoned ship, and some would later eat human flesh as a way to survive. Out of the 8 men that got to that island, only Thompson and McCrone were rescued. Ottawa in Canada, there was a thing called the Chippewa Massacre, and this was a British trade post called Fort Pickawillany, and the Native Americans burst in and they boiled and then ate the residents and the traders. In 1763, North American Indians performed a ritual cannibalism on a British soldier during the siege of Fort Detroit. They captured a man who'd been given a horse who was trying to get to another fort to bring help. However, he was stripped in front of the fort, cooked alive on a fire, and whilst he was still alive, the Native Americans carved various parts of his flesh from his body and ate it. They say that they began with his genitals. So let's move on to the 1800s. I've brought you from 100,000 years BC right up to the 1800s, so no reason to stop now. Something very famous in the 1800s, the Boyd Massacre. 66 passengers on board ship and the crew of the Boyd were killed and eaten by Maoris in Northland, New Zealand. Then, everybody's heard of Tchaikovsky's incredible 1812 overture. Well, during the French invasion of Russia in 1812, some of Napoleon's soldiers were starving in the Russian winter, so they ended up going onto the battlefield, trying to find a freshly dead body, either of the enemy or of one of their own. They cooked it, they ate it, and they survived. A French frigate called the Méduse ran aground in Mauritania. 147 passengers and crew had to dive into the sea, and some of them on rafts and holding bits of wood. 13 days they had to hang on there until they were rescued. Some of the occupants of the raft got so horrified at the way things were going, some of them committed suicide and were eaten. Others, the larger, more meaty individuals, were murdered and eaten. Only 5 men survived. Another famous ship, a whaler called the Essex, was actually sunk by a sperm whale in 1820. Captain Pollard's ship spent 90 days in amongst small whaling boats before being rescued. 7 of the people who died during their time there had been eaten. Some after they died, 2 volunteered to be sacrificed. And one of the small boats was found containing 2 survivors sucking on the marrow of a human bone taken from a man's chest. Now, it was the story of the Essex that would lead Herman Melville, who was related to the performer Moby, to write his novel, Moby Dick. I suppose you probably already worked that out. In 1822, an Irish convict called Alexander Pierce escaped from a prison on Van Diemen's Land in Australia. He was later captured near Hobart, and he confessed that he and other escapees had killed numerous other prisoners over a period of weeks, and he was the last survivor. They killed one another until only he was standing. the ship Francis Mary crashed onto an island. Cannibalism ensued. Now, according to a magazine called The Coffin Handbills, a man called Andrew Jackson, not the president, murdered 1,000 Native American Indians, and he slept amongst their bodies, and in the morning he got up and he cut his favourite pieces from 12 bodies and then cooked them and ate them for breakfast. A missionary from London, John Williams, he was killed and eaten at Dillon Bay in Erromango Island in Vanuatu. So many stories of ships and their crews. In Malta, in 1840, the crew of a ship were massacred in an unknown location in West Africa by pygmies, who were cannibals. And the rest of the crew came back and told of how a lot of people were killed, not so their flesh could be eaten, they were beheaded so that gallons of blood could ultimately pour out and they could feast on the blood. 5 other sailors were waiting to have a similar fate when the flagon of blood ran out. You would think that as we got closer and closer to the present day, cannibalism would slowly wear itself out, and yet it never has. A man whose name or nickname became Liver-Eating Johnson helped massacre an innocent village of Crow warriors and their wives and their children, and he cut the livers out of all of them, even newly born babies, and he ate them. There was a thing called the Donner Party in the US, a group of settlers. They got stuck in snow in the Sierra Nevada mountains, so they picked the people who were most sick and they ate them. Sir John Franklin's Arctic expedition of 1845, when they were lost, they were found to have resorted to eating one another as they tried to push across King William Island in Canada towards the Black River. Now, if we're looking for nicknames, another famous cannibal, Boone Helm, he was known as the Kentucky Cannibal. He was a mountain man, a fugitive, a serial killer, and he would eat the human flesh of those people that he killed. He claimed it was out of living in extreme conditions. But he made no secret that he loved it, and he said, "Many the poor devil I've killed at one time or another, and the time has been that I've been obliged to feed on some of them." In the US, 10 survivors were found 2 months after the Utter Party massacre of 1860, where it was found that they'd eaten 5 of their dead comrades. 1874, 3 British sailors survived the disaster of the Cospatrick sinking by eating one another. An American prospector, Alfred Packer, was accused of cannibalism. He was first tried for murder and then eventually sentenced to 40 years in prison after being convicted of manslaughter. In court, the manslaughter was how he had to strangle somebody so that he could eat them. There was an expedition in 1880 to try and make way for the Trans-Saharan Railway from Algeria all the way across to Sudan. Within about 3 days, every single member of the expedition were massacred by hostile Tuaregs. The majority of the 93 men were killed, over 200 camels taken, but 56 survivors, including 4 Frenchmen, began to retreat and run away into the desert with little food and little water, constantly chased and harassed by Tuaregs. And those people that the Tuaregs had managed to kill were eaten by the rest. Only 7 out of the 93 men survived. Now, there's a case of 4 crew members of an English yacht called the Mignonette. They were cast away in a storm 1,600 miles from the Cape of Good Hope. After a few days, one of the crew, a 17-year-old boy, fell unconscious due to starvation and drinking seawater. The others decided to kill him and eat him. They were picked up 4 days later. 2 of the 3 survivors found guilty of murder, and this was a significant outcome of the case. And they deemed there was no defence against a charge of murder, even if it saved your life. In 1892, we were trying to get a little bit more educated and a little less eaty, if that's how we call it. But during October 1888, and again, if you want to experience who Jack the Ripper is, you could download an entire expedition where I go down to Whitechapel, walk the streets and talk you through each of the murders, and we use experts to narrow down who Jack the Ripper was, and we think we know for sure. And that's available on robsonsworld.com if you fancy heading in that direction. Because during the Whitechapel murders, George Lusk received a letter with half a preserved human kidney, and the writer was Jack the Ripper, who claimed to have fried and eaten the other half of it. So Jack the Ripper was a cannibal too. So let's get into the 1900s. A number of Protestant missionaries were murdered and cannibalized in Papua New Guinea in 1901. Remember, they're still eating people there. And during the course of the Bailundo Revolt, a group of rebels decapitated a merchant called Antonio de Severa, roasted, and then ate his body. The rebels forced Silveira's wife to carry his head around in a basket. The killing was supposed to be a ritual to create a thing called success magic. Another ship sank, a steamship called the Dumaru, and the crew spent 3 weeks adrift on a lifeboat, and the ship exploded and sank into the Western Pacific in 1918. When their food and water ran out, they ate the sick and drank their blood, saying it's better if you can drink their blood when they're alive, otherwise it tends to clot. Okay, into the 1920s, drawing a veil over the First World War, where there was a degree of cannibalism, the Russian famine between 1921 and 1922, cannibalism was not just reported, it was common. Then, in the 20s, a serial killer, Albert Fish, consumed his victims too. He owned up in court to molesting more than 400 children over 20 years, murdering, some say up to 6, others say a minimum of 15. His psychiatrist, a man called Vertum, said that Fish looked like a meek and innocuous little old man, gentle and benevolent, friendly and polite. In fact, if you wanted someone to entrust your child to, he would be the one you would choose, he said. But Fish was a paedophile and a cannibal. His most infamous murder was that of Grace Budd. He cut her flesh into strips. He cooked it with carrots, onions and strips of bacon. And he said whenever he ate human flesh, it gave him an erection. Wortham described how Fish's account of how to cook the dead body was as simple and as straightforward as a housewife describing her favourite methods of cooking. You just had to remember that the meat he was discussing was a tiny little girl. Not to be outdone, in Germany, in 1924, Karl Denk was found guilty of killing and eating 40 people. Let's move into the 1930s. Surely we're coming close to stopping. No. An author called James Chrisman wrote a book in the 30s about the people who lived in the Appalachian Mountains, and they ate parts of their dead relatives in order to honour them. Now, the New York Times reporter, William Seabrook, researched these kind of things, and he went to the Sorbonne, the huge university in Paris, and there he ate a chunk of human meat cut from the body of a healthy human being who was killed in an accident. He then cooked and ate it. He explained it as this: it was like good, fully developed veal. Not young, but not yet beef. It was very definitely like that. It was not like any other meat I've ever tasted. It was so nearly like good, fully developed veal that I think no person with a palate of ordinary, normal sensitiveness could distinguish it from veal. It was mild, a good meat, with no other sharply defined or highly characteristic tastes. For example, goat or game or pork. The steak was slightly tougher than prime veal, a little stringy, but not too tough or stringy to be disagreeable. The roast, from which I cut and ate a central slice, was tender, and in colour, texture and smell was well tasty. Strengthened my certainty that all meats we habitually know, veal is one meat to which this meat is accurately comparable. And I did talk to a cannibal killer, and you can check him out and hear what he had to say in The Dark Side of Paris, another 3-4 hour adventure available on robsonsworld.com. Okay, in Ukraine in the 30s, cannibalism was widespread. 1 in 3 people in the Ukraine ate human meat. In December 1934, a grave robber and somebody they thought was a serial killer called Alonzo Robinson was arrested for the axe slaying of a couple called Turner in their Cleveland, Mississippi home. When they came to arrest him, they found various items, salted and cured portions of human flesh belonging to Mrs. Turner. They found salted and cooked breasts, complete with teeth marks in the pockets of his overalls. Also in the 1930s, Leonarda Cianlucci killed 3 women, turning their bodies into tea cakes, which she fed to others, as well as eating herself. Let's move into the 1940s then. What happened there, cannibalism-wise? Well, it was confirmed then that in Sierra Leone, the Ivory Coast, and in Liberia, there were still active tribes of cannibals. There were even eyewitnesses to cannibalism during the siege of Leningrad during World War II, including reports of people cutting off slices of their own bodies and eating them rather than starve. And following the war, there were numerous survivors who had huge strips of flesh hacked off their own legs just so that they could survive. And when the Germans surrendered, roughly 100,000 German soldiers had been taken prisoner of war. Nearly all of them were sent to prisoner of war camps in Siberia, and their captors, a lot of them very short of food, ended up eating the German prisoners. Fewer than 5,000 of all of the prisoners captured at Stalingrad survived the captivity. Many of them would die of exposure or sickness, and others were eaten. In 1942, soldiers from Finland discovered the dead bodies of a Soviet partisan that had been butchered and eaten by his own side in Sijavi in Finland. Cannibalism in the concentration and death camps was also tragically common. The Australian War Crimes section of the Tokyo Tribunal collected a whole range of reports documenting acts of Japanese soldiers eating the enemy dead. People that died in prison camps were cooked and fed to their soldiers. In the case of Japanese prisoner of war camps, in some cases, flesh was cut from living people. A British Indian Army prisoner of war, Lance Naik Hatem Ali, who was a citizen of Pakistan, he testified that the Japanese started selecting prisoners, and every day one prisoner was taken out and killed and eaten by the Japanese soldiers. He said, "I personally saw this happen, and about 100 prisoners were eaten at this place by the Japanese across half a year. The remainder of us were taken to another spot 50 miles away where 10 prisoners died of sickness. At this place, the Japanese again started choosing prisoners to eat. Those selected were taken to a hut where their flesh was cut from their bodies while they were still alive, and they were thrown into a ditch where they all would later die." Is it any wonder that so few people want to talk about what happened during the war? Another famous and well-documented cannibal case occurred in Chichijima in 1945. 5 American airmen were captured by Japanese soldiers. They were stripped, washed, they were stunned, and then flesh was cut from their body, and the men were eaten by 30 Japanese soldiers. 5 of them were found guilty and were hanged. So let's get into the 1950s, the birth of rock and roll. Surely by then, many of you would still be alive back in the 50s and the 1960s. Yet it still went on. Between 1957 and 1960, the Kuru epidemic of the 4 people, approximately 1,000 deaths. A German serial killer, Joachim Kroll, that they called the Duisburg Man-Eater, was arrested for practicing cannibalism. In 1961, those Papuan Aborigines killed and ate Michael Rockefeller while he was exploring the southern Netherlands and New Guinea. In 1963, in Czechoslovakia, Josef Kulik, who was in the army at the time, killed 2 young lads at a railway station. He cut their bodies open from neck to belly button, ripped by hand out some of their internal organs, put them on a dustbin lid and roasted them. After he did, he ate them with a bottle of wine. He used some funeral wreaths from the local cemetery for fuel. An awful lot of cannibalism occurred during the Cultural Revolution in China in 1968. So let's get into the 70s. In 1970, the police arrested a man called Stanley Baker for killing and eating a man in Montana, in the USA. In 1972, the survivors of a Uruguayan Air Force flight that had a rugby team from the Stella Maris College in Montevideo and some of their family members, it crashed, and they ended up having to eat one another. A film called Alive was made about the whole incident. You may have seen it. Also in 1972, the same time that crash happened in the Andes, Martin Hartwell crashed his small plane near the Arctic Circle in the Northwest Territories of Canada. 3 passengers died, and it took them months to find them. Hartwell survived by eating one of the bodies. In 1977, a Briton, Robert Maudsley, in prison, killed his cellmate, and when the jailer broke into the cell that he'd bombarded closed, he had smashed the top of his cellmate's head in and was scooping out his brain and eating it. In 77 and 78, The vampire of Sacramento, a man called Richard Chase, ate parts of his poor victims, drinking their blood because he believed to do that would cure the illnesses that he thought he had. Also, in 1979, Albert Fentress lured an 18-year-old high school student to his room where he was murdered and cannibalized. And Nikolai Zhumagaliev killed 7 women in Russia, cannibalizing their corpses. So we're all the way up to the 1980s. And in 81, Issei Sagawa murdered a Dutch woman, shooting her in the neck with a rifle at his home in Paris, had sex with a dead body, and then started eating raw her buttocks and thighs and genitalia. He was captured trying to dump the body into a lake in a park. Ladislav Hoyer, a serial killer from Czechoslovakia, confessed to killing a woman in 1981. He cut off her breasts and vagina and then tried to eat the vagina with mustard after boiling it in salty water. He admitted he'd thrown part of it away because it didn't taste very nice at all. Michael Woodmansey was convicted in 1983 of kidnapping and killing little 5-year-old Jason Foreman in South Kingston, Rhode Island. And there was evidence at the time that Woodmansey had written in his journal that he'd eaten part of the little boy. In 1986, Haddon Clark killed and cannibalized a 6-year-old called Michelle Dorr. In 1986, Gary Hednick abducted 6 women, and after one of the women, his hostages, died, he fed the others a mixture of dog food and the previous woman's human flesh. An artist called Rick Gibson in 1988 performed an act of cannibalism by eating a canopy of donated human tonsils. A year later, he publicly ate a slice of legally purchased human testicle. When he tried to eat another slice of testicle in Vancouver in 1989, he was stopped by the police. However, the charge was dropped, and he eventually ate the testicle as an hors d'oeuvre in Vancouver. Okay, we're in the 1990s. How close are we to today? Jeffrey Dahmer in Wisconsin murdered 17 men and boys, and he admitted to police that he'd cut up the thighs, the biceps, the internal organs of numerous victims and cooked them in a stove-top skillet before eating them. He said they tasted like the best filet mignon. In 1991, Honor Mayor Ari Nelson was murdered, cut into pieces and eaten by her husband, William Bill Nelson, in California. The pathologist said that Bill was still alive when Omima began butchering his body. What made it worse, they were newlyweds at the time. She boiled and cooked his head in the oven. She then ate the flesh from the face and stored the foil-wrapped skull in her freezer. Then she skinned the rest of his body, deep-fried his hands in oil, and then cooked and dipped his ribs in barbecue sauce, and then ate them. Andrei Chikatilo, a serial killer in Ukraine, experienced killing and cannibalism, and he was convicted for murder in 1992 and executed. During the North Korean famine between 1994 and 1998, there were various stories of cannibalism from their refugees. In 1995, a 21-year-old Brazilian farmer, Marinaldo de Alcantara Silva, killed his own mum with a knife and then ate some parts of her face before being shot dead by a soldier who disturbed them. Ilshat Kuzikov in Russia, convicted in 1997 of eating 3 of his best friends in 1992. Makes you wonder what he'd do to his enemies. In Indonesia in 1999, the Madurese people were eaten by a tribe of Dayaks, part of a long-running ethnic conflict there. And also, the Snowtown murders in South Australia were quite famous in 1991, especially when it revealed that two of the murderers had fried and eaten part of their victims. Dorangel Vargas, known as El Comediante, that's the people eater, was a Venezuelan serial killer. He killed and ate 10 men within 2 years. And in 1999, Kazakhstani authorities arrested 3 male psychiatric nurses because they had hired 7 prostitutes, killed and ate them. And so it goes on. Into the 2000s, Catherine Wright killed her partner, John Price, cooked his corpse, and then served it to his children. The Chinese performance artist Zhu Yu said that he had prepared, cooked, and eaten human fetuses. In Germany, Armin Meus posted the internet advert looking for a young man willing to be slaughtered and eaten. That case would lead to 2 songs, Mein Teil by Rammstein and Eaten by Bloodbath, both based on the same story. In Kansas, Mark Sappington went on murder spree and was convicted of murdering 4 of his friends, and he ate the leg of one of his victims. In 2002, a number of Ukrainians were arrested in Kiev for killing and eating a teenage girl. They were suspected of eating up to 6 people. They say they were Satanists. In 2003, the rap artist Big Lurch was convicted for the murder and partial consumption of one of his friends when he was high on PCP. The French government would report that a prison inmate ate his cellmate in the prison in Rouen. Also in September 2007, a man called Özgür Dengiz was arrested in Ankara, the Turkish capital, after killing and eating a man. He cut slices of flesh from his body and then gave the rest to stray dogs in the street. In January 2008, an ex-rebel and a reformed warlord called Joshua Bahi confessed to eating human sacrifices that included the killing of an innocent child and the plucking out of the 5-year-old's heart that was divided into pieces for us to eat. The cannibalism of so many children occurred during the conflict. The murder of Tim McLean happened in 2008. He was a Canadian, stabbed, beheaded, and his body eaten. What made this more sensational was this all happened on a bus. How many of us have done this? You're on a bus, it's a long journey, so you get your head down, you have a bit of a snooze, and that's exactly what happened to McLean. He was asleep with his headphones on when the man sitting next to him, Vincent Lee, suddenly produced a large knife and started stabbing him in the neck and chest. He then slowly hacked off McLean's head, severed other body parts from him, and was sitting there eating McLean when the police got on the bus to arrest him. A group of 33 immigrants from the Dominican Republic were en route to Puerto Rico, and they were lost at sea for 15 days, and they started eating the sick. Then they were rescued by an American Coast Guard patrol boat. In 2009, 5 members of the Colina tribe in Brazil were wanted by Brazilian authorities for murdering, butchering, and eating a farmer. In 2009, 2 men from Perm in Russia killed and ate their brother. In 2009, Angelo Mendoza was charged with mayhem, torture, child cruelty, and inflicting an injury to a child because he pulled out his 4-year-old son's left eye and chewed it. In San Antonio, Texas, Ottie Sanchez was found in a hysterical state, having killed her own 3-week-old son and ate most of his corpse. In Russia, cannibalism seems pretty common. Now, that was just 10 years ago. So what's happened since? This could go on forever, our cannibal sojourn. Let's take a look at Bradford then. Stephen Griffiths killed and ate 3 prostitutes, and he became known as the crossbow cannibal. In 2011, in Pakistan, brothers Arif Ali and Farman Ali ate a human corpse stolen from the grave. They also found a whole load of body parts in their house. In 2014, they were arrested again, making curry out of a human corpse, the body of a 2-year-old child. In 2011, a model in the Leningrad area of Russia drowned her colleague and consumed part of her corpse. In 2011, police found the body parts of various people in serial killer Matyev Kirko's refrigerator, including the body parts of 2 Slovak women who disappeared the year earlier. In South Korea, the authorities discovered that various capsules of drugs contained a powder made from the corpses of dead babies, passing them off as stamina boosters. The 2 presenters of the Dutch TV show Prof Konjen, Dennis Storm and Valerio Zeno, appeared to eat each other's flesh on air in 2011. They had a piece of muscle surgically removed, fried and eaten in front of a studio audience. Later, the stunt was revealed to be a hoax. In Florida, a guy ate a homeless man in Bridgeport. Not wanting to be outdone in Vladivostok, a man killed his friend, hacked off all of the flesh, minced it, and sold it at the local market. In 2012, a Japanese artist, Mao Sugiyama, cut off and served his genitals to 5 people. Each of the diners paid $250 per portion. In 2012, a man and 2 women were arrested in Brazil for murdering 2 women and eating their flesh. The 2 women used the flesh for making pasties that they sold in the town. In 2012, Jiming Liu was arrested for killing his wife and eating some of her flesh in Massachusetts. An exchange student from Ghana was murdered by Alexander Kinyui in Maryland. Kinyui had eaten the sex organs. In Florida, Miami, the police shot and killed Rudy Eugene. He was found on the MacArthur Causeway naked, eating the face of a homeless man, Ronald Popo. 29 members of a cannibal cult were arrested in Papua New Guinea after eating 7 people, 4 men and 3 women. Japanese authorities convicted 3 men for killing and eating one of their friends in 2009. In 2012, in the gardens in Assam, India, a man and his wife were murdered by an angry mob of workers who then fed on the bodies. The Chinese cannibal Zhang Yongming, aged 57, was executed for his crimes. He had sold his victims' flesh as ostrich meat, keeping the eyeballs in wine that he enjoyed as a treat. In 2013, British punk rock musician David Playpence ate his finger after it was severed in a motorbike accident. In 2013, a 47-year-old man mutilated, sexually assaulted and ate pieces of a 77-year-old woman in Ontario. In 2013, during the Syrian civil war, a rebel called Abu Saka was filmed cutting open the body of a fallen enemy soldier and biting into one of his organs. Lino Renzi, aged 45, was discovered by police cooking the remains of his mother, aged 73. The police had been called by a neighbour who smelled a disgusting odour coming from Renzi's apartment, caused by some intestine chunks burning on the grill. Other parts of his man were in the freezer, oven and pots, but most of the corpse lay in the bathroom. The legs and arms mutilated, the intestines removed, and he had beaten his man to death after a quarrel, didn't want to waste the meat. In 2014, the BBC reported that a Christian called Mad Dog ate his Muslim rival's foot during a conflict. A man from Jeffersonville in Indiana killed and ate parts of his girlfriend. A crowd stoned to death and burnt some members of the Allied Democratic Forces in the Congo. When the body was brought forward, they cooked and ate it. In 2015, a Reuters report revealed that the Mexican La Familia Michoacana and Knights Templar cartels were forcing their recruits to eat the hearts of their victims as an initiation ritual. At Florida State University, a student, Austin Haroof, stabbed a couple, Michelle Mishkon and John Stevens, in their garage and ate their faces before deputies could pull them away. In 2017, a ring of cannibals was arrested by police in South Africa. A CNN documentary series called Believers showed journalist Reza Asyan consuming a portion of human brain given to him by a sect. In Russia, Dmitry Bakshiv and Natalia Baksheva were arrested in Krasnodar for 30 cannibalistic murders. A father and a son were detained in the Ukraine after beheading an ex-police officer and totally eating his body. A guy from Reddit discussed how he legally obtained and cooked an amputated foot with 10 of his friends after a motorcycle accident. His foot hadn't healed. The doctors recommended amputation, and the man then asked his friends, remember how we always talked about if you ever had the chance to eat human meat, would you? So his friends shared the meat cut from his amputated foot. In 2019, Alberto Sanchez Gomez was arrested in Madrid when he had confessed to killing his mother, cutting the body into 1,000 pieces and sharing the meat with his dog. And in December 2019, the mutilated body of Kevin Bacon, a hairstylist from Michigan, was found hanging from the ceiling of the home of a man he'd met on a gay dating app, Grindr. The murderer said he'd cut off and eaten Bacon's testicles. And every year, there's more stories of cannibalism. So when people talk about it as if it's just something that people do in weird cultures hundreds of years ago, no, it isn't. It's something we've been doing for over 100,000 years. And trust me, within the next week or so, more of it will be happening, perhaps close to you. Now, as you know, at the present moment, we've got a new book out called Grisly Tales from Northumbria. It's available on the robsonsworld.com website. There's a link directly to the publisher. And if you fancy getting your hands on a copy, Amazon and all the obvious places will have it. And essentially, we go looking for incredible true stories and people who believe absolutely that they have witnessed ghosts, and where you can go, over 160 places to go and see them. Let me tell you about another. This is a story of Jarrow. When the first Romans arrived in the northeast in 43 BC during the Gallic Wars, and the first job for them seemed pretty obvious. You got to put down any tribes that fought against you. And they were very successful because they would show no mercy, wiping out entire tribal systems. However, The Romans then put the surviving boy children into their armies, so they had no choice but to assimilate. In 1866, 2 inscribed Roman stones were found in Jarrow during a repair to the nave of the church. It read, "The barbarians were scattered and the province of Britain freed. A boundary was established between 2 oceans, a distance of 80 miles. Jarrow back then was called Portus Egfrid, the port of King Egfrid, and many of the tribes originated in Scandinavia, Central and Eastern Europe, but had settled in the mongrel land of Britain. But there's one story told to me by an elderly historian that has a ring of truth to it. The Romans were right to brag that the entire country, except for much of Scotland, was totally under their control. Yet around 408 to 410, the city of Rome was under threat, and they decided to give the island back to the ancient Britons. Once it had been proclaimed, groups of barbarians, who were essentially members of various tribes that the Romans had tried to subjugate or wipe out, decided that now was the time to regroup. They thought if it could be seen by common folk that they had actually chased the Romans away, they would have much greater status. So they raided as many Roman legions heading south as they could, in numerous cases wiping them out, leaving the generals no choice but to leave in greater numbers. Slowly but surely the Roman settlements were either being burnt down or taken over by locals who had suffered second-class citizenship for about 450 years. Yet in Jarrow it said that this is where the last hurrah took place. Now we know for certain there was a battle, for they found many weapons and bones during excavations, but this is the story that has passed down the centuries. Having sunken 4 boats docked at the Staithes on the Jarrow riverside, these barbarians, or locals as I prefer to call them, thought that they were invincible. Now many of them were not even good fighters. There were about 130 men who had spent their lives hiding from the Romans. Now they had a chance to hurt them. They had stolen weapons and valuables from the ships, and this brought about an insane kind of bravery. The ships were going to the Roman elite and their families, who would travel across to Gaul and then on to Rome. But now they would have to plod slowly down the country with Roman troops. The Romans knew if they were being preyed on by a ragtag force, how bad would it be further along their march? So a number of legions were hidden outside of Jarrow, roughly where Chester Street is now, in tents in a thick forest. The Roman train started heading south. All of the remaining Romans and their camp followers, they were the first slaughtered for liaising with the enemy. Throats were slit as they slept, and their bodies were found burning in a heap in the morning. The families of the richer Romans were terrified, but they had no choice but to keep their carts in convoy, surrounded by soldiers, the stink of burning flesh filling the air each morning as the eastern wind sent the smell following the caravan as it headed away from the Jarrow area. The locals, now had closer to 200 men in their ranks as the Roman convoy began passing the woods towards Chester Street. Now, despite there being about 300 soldiers in the long Roman line, they thought by using surprise tactics to wipe them out. So they hid in trees and bushes, picking off anyone who wandered a few paces off the trail. And after killing about 30, they were feeling even more confident, so they decided just to charge in. And as they did, the Romans joined shields to form an impenetrable barrier against their attack, using spears and their short swords, pushing the local warriors back into the woods. But at that very moment, almost 400 additional legionnaires appeared behind them. They couldn't move forward, they couldn't move back on either side, and they were wiped out, except for one 14-year-old boy who climbed up a tall tree and hid. The Romans hacked their attackers to pieces, capturing their leaders and parading them in front of the Roman consuls who travelled with them. They were executed by the soldiers, who tied them to trees and used them for archery practice. The bodies were left there as a warning to anyone else daring to face the might of Rome, even in their retreat, and very few others did. The young boy returned home to Jarrow and told the story, hence it passed down the line. And the feeling in the woods now is a one of sorrow. Many people have witnessed dark figures moving between the trees. The remnants of the wood now help form Druitt's Park, named after a man who once owned Jarrow Hall. Many ghost hunters claim to hear children singing or monks chanting in the area, yet there's no stories of any gravity there. Bede Monastery, on the other hand, had various visits from the Vikings, and on several occasions monks were captured and skinned alive. The skin, once totally removed, was folded into a small pile and nailed to the door of the monastery. The Vikings believed that fake priests were abusing local people, and they believed they were doing people a favour in getting rid of them, taking all of their gold and valuables at the same time. And there are hundreds of cases of people seeing the spirits of monks in and around the building. And finally, let me tell you another story that you can experience with me on robsonsworld.com. We go on a grisly trail of Bermuda. And it's there that I have a tale to tell that is called the Explosion of Skulls. Every few years, the glorious heaven that Bermuda is suffers a storm of immense force. And back in 2003, Hurricane Fabian arrived. It was classed as a Category 3. Low numbers like that make it sound as if it's not too bad. Yet in reality, there are gusting winds at 125 miles an hour. Trees torn out by their roots, roofs torn off homes. 4 people were swept off the causeway to their death, and thousands were left without electricity for days. Because Bermuda, unlike the Caribbean islands to the south, is isolated, it's completely on its own, and it gets even more regular hurricane alerts. But we need to go back in history for a surprise hurricane that settled a dispute that could have led to almost a civil war on the island. Now, very early in America's War of Independence, George Washington, who was then merely a general, was fighting to free America from the colonial rule by the British. And he heard that in Bermuda the British had a huge powder magazine on St. George's North Shore, so he began a plan to sail down and steal it. They were really short of munitions. Now, many Bermudans wanted their freedom from the British rule too, and they'd tipped Washington off about the gunpowder. Yet most on the island were keen to keep in with the British, so these two different groups were at odds, and it could so very easily have become part of America's War of Independence. Now, long before Washington could get his men down to Bermuda to steal the gunpowder, a group of pro-British Bermudans had requisitioned 3 whaleboats and made a secret landing in Tobacco Bay. The men guarding the gunpowder belonged to a local grower called Cabot, who hated British rule, and he wanted Washington to get the powder. The Bermudans eased tiles off the roof of the magazine and they slid inside to get the barreled gunpowder ready to be moved. But just then they were surprised by a uniformed guard who was just about to shoot when one of the burglars wedged a sharp tile into his throat. He fell to the floor, gasping for breath, and finally drowned in his own blood. Now, rather than make it look as if common thieves had murdered a man to steal the powder, they dragged out his body and buried it on the land of Bermuda's governor, George James Brewer, who was a self-centered, arrogant and brutal man who also wanted rid of British rule. On one occasion he told a group of Bermudan dignitaries that, "If I were made king of Bermuda and the British put to flight, I would double your annual profit at a stroke." Well, that sort of line may well have worked if coming from a politician with any degree of morality, but coming from him it sounded more like wind and piss. So just over 100 barrels of gunpowder were rolled down the hill into the boats and they vanished into the darkness. Now the governor was white with rage, demanding the heads of any Bermudan involved in such a crime. But even so, the powder found its way into the hands of George Washington, eventually exactly what Brewer really wanted, but he was the British governor, so he had to maintain this kind of two-faced outrage because the British were making him rich. And it was at this point that a group of rebels thought it was time that they would begin rallying Bermudans against British rule. Now, many people had great sympathy for the American cause of freedom, for they too had been colonised by a superpower of its day, yet they simply didn't have enough men to take on the people that were loyal to King George III. It's interesting that 100 years after the gunpowder theft, the body of the murdered man was exhumed and they discovered he was a French officer. It may well have been that Brewer was dealing with enemies of the British. We really did play for all sides. Yet from the outside, everyone believed him to be totally loyal to the Crown. In fact, in what is currently the post office on the island, he kept American prisoners in the very worst conditions. No wounds were ever tended, so the stink of rotten flesh, decay, and that sweet smell of gangrene filled the rooms. There were cells enough for 20, yet they held 190 men in there at any time, the living next to the dying. They provided enough food for 10 men per day, so death, disease and misery was inevitable. On one occasion, a priest from Scotland visited the cells and wrote, "I visited hell today, and it can be found in Bermuda. The island is the most beautiful place on earth that I have ever seen, and yet, in those dark cells, I saw the black heart of humanity. As I walked through building in one cell, a man had just died, and there before me, I saw around 15 prisoners tearing the dead body apart and eating it raw. Uncooked innards being chewed into so those poor broken bodies could get water from the corpse. Each man so desperate to stay alive, they would endure even this vile indignity. What was so much worse was seeing the eyes of the men in other cells, so jealous that one of their number had not perished so that they could do the same. I asked if I could give these men water and was abruptly told, 'Don't waste it.' I never thought that I would ever see something that would prove to me that under certain conditions we humans can become as wild and vicious as any animal. There was rebellion in the air though. Something was stirring, and many believed there was an inevitability that a civil war was about to break up. And then nature intervened, and a massive hurricane began to roll in from the east. The rain was pounding, already the palm trees folding over and being torn away. Yet plans had been made to start trouble that night, and the rebels thought that perhaps the bad weather would help them. So that morning, each area leader headed to Hamilton. In total, about 11 from St George's, Smiths, Devonshire, Pembroke, Paget, Warwick, Southampton and Sandys. Each one had dozens of men armed to the teeth in readiness to attack. They were going for government buildings, castles, forts and the harbour. The plan was to meet, decide on targets, and then later that same day, so that no one could inform on them, they would begin their attack. With the weather as fierce as it was, had the attacks gone ahead, there was a very good chance that Bermuda could have found themselves with an independent land. Yet it seems that the weather was firmly on the side of the Crown. The rebel leaders had discussed their strategy. They were ready, so were all about to leave their hideaways, a building and buildings very close to Shelley Bay. But the hurricane was now on the island and turning huge homes into matchwood. It was a vicious thing, hurling boats all over the island, moving rocks and stones that had been excavated to widen a nearby causeway on Tucker Way and turning them into missiles. People throughout the centuries have spoken how vital it is to have been in the right place at the right time. Yet there is equal necessity never to be at the wrong place at the wrong time. The rebel leaders were battling against a wind that stole their breath, but they were pumped up with adrenaline and ready for their great moment in history. Edward Gallagher was the rebel leader from Warwick and wrote about what happened next, actively changing the future for Bermuda. He wrote, "It was 2 in the afternoon, yet black as midnight. As we stepped out of the house, we could barely see, with rain horizontally hitting us in the face, mixed with sand, soil, and small stones, fired so hard at us that it cut our faces. There ahead of us stood a twisting, coiling tornado, and we were afeard that it would change direction and move towards us. Yet after we stood a while, we saw it move across the land and into the sea. 'Twas then that our leader, John Rolls, told us to make our way to our men, and at 9 that night we attack." We approached the narrow causeway and could not believe how powerful the wind was. It blew a house over our heads that had belonged to Miss Pevensey, and I swear I could see her in it as it fell to pieces in the sea. We could not believe what was happening. The tornado had turned and was now in Tucker Bay and stood 100 feet from us, knocking us all off our feet. We knew that we had to get across the causeway, and we began scrambling our way away from that beast that roared at us. We were in the middle of it when I saw clearly what happened. Piled up on a nearby dock, huge stones in readiness to extend and bolster the thin causeway. There was a sound like Satan howling, and I saw literally hundreds of them just explode and fired across the causeway 10 times faster than a cannonball. I led the group and had slipped down into a pothole, and on seeing them coming, instantly lay as flat as I could, staring at my compatriots following me. I shouted to them, but I could not be heard with such a vociferous fury that I remained unheard. That very second I watched as at least 4 of their skulls just exploded. Then our leader, John Rolls, was hit so hard that his head and shoulder were torn off and flew past me. I was crying, for they had been my dearest of friends, and I remember lying there for what seemed to be hours. Then, as the noise began to turn from roar to the relative calm of strong rain, I climbed up and was alone on the promontory. There was blood everywhere, and a pair of human legs wedged between the huge stones. I was the only one to survive. History knows naught of us, yet had that storm never happened, we could have been the kings of the island of Bermuda. So if you are lucky enough to get there and you're walking along the silent, pure white sandy beaches, it's hard to believe that they've ever had any other weather than absolute sun. Yet apparently along that causeway near Tucker Bay, there are strange sightings of spirit almost every early evening. Shadowy images of those people torn to pieces by the sheer force of nature. And that is Alan Robson's Grisly Tale for now. Hope you've enjoyed them. If you have, please head across to robsonsworld.com. Major changes happening there very, very soon indeed, and I think you will enjoy them very much. A lot of stuff there for you if you just want to close your eyes and go into a different world and see in your mind's eye everything that I saw on ghostly tours, ghostly trips, dark trips overseas. There's an awful lot there for you, including that amazing Jack the Ripper story. Regressions in many of the things we do. I hope you find something of interest. And until we're together again, from me, Alan Robson, God bless you, and I wish you well.
Mm-hmm.